Welcome to the L&D Go Beyond podcast. This is the show that brings you real, actionable workplace learning insights from some of the brightest minds in the L&D space. This season, we're diving into the realm of learning impact. Join experts as they share their knowledge and experiences, helping us push the boundaries of what's possible when it comes to delivering impactful learning. Get ready to go beyond. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of the L&D Go Beyond podcast, where we gather insights from experts to help L&D teams truly go beyond. Our focus in this season 2 of the podcast has been on learning impact. And today we have someone who will give us a practitioner's perspective on how this topic plays out inside organizations. Our guest today is Christopher Lin. Hi, Chris. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Amit. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting.
Oh, fantastic. I'm so happy that you could join us today. Chris, let me quickly introduce you to our audience. Chris is a tech analyst and industry advisor. He's currently the Chief Learning Officer at ChenMed. He's also the host of Future Focused, and he's a devoted husband and father of 7 under 13. How exciting is that, Chris?
Yeah, it's a lot. It definitely keeps me on my toes, and I joke that that's why I don't have any hair on the top of my head. It all fell down to my face. So,
No,
but I enjoy it.
yeah, I'm sure it is amazing. Amazing. Welcome again, Chris. I'm so happy you could join us today.
Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to it. We'll have fun. It's fun being on the other side of the microphone.
I
So,
know I have listened to you on your podcast. Very excited to have you here. So before we get started, I mean, or to get you started, why don't you take us through your journey so far, a little bit about your journey, where you have been,
sure.
where you are today, so that we can see where you're coming from.
Yeah, my background's kind of an interesting one in that everybody thought I was going to be a technical person. I
Mhm.
was big into computers, big into building computers, big into coding computers. And so that's what people said I should do. So I went to school for it. And I really thought it was not that interesting. It was easy, but it wasn't that interesting. But I was really interested in people and how people were being affected by technology, but just also human development. And so I think they didn't really know what to do with me. So they said, well, you should be a teacher then, just teach. And so I thought, well, I mean, I don't know. I'm 17 years old. What do I know? And so I ended up going into education. So I still pursued the technical side, but then I pursued education as well and started as a middle school math and computer teacher. And the education side, it wasn't for me because traditional academia just didn't fit. I'm like, this is not my thing. And the parents were the worst. And so then I really was kind of lost because I had no idea what to do. And so I kind of fumbled around early in my career, but it was actually a company I was with observed that I took a sales role because I didn't really know what else to do. But the company observed that when I joined the territory, everybody around me started performing better. And so they noticed it, which good on them. They noticed it and they reached out and asked if I was doing anything. And I mentioned how I was putting together a bunch of resources and I had created like a small group where we were kind of staying collaborative and helping each other out. I didn't know that was called corporate learning. I just was doing it. And so they did. They go, well, would you like to help us build our onboarding program? And I just remember going like, I have no idea what that is, but that sounds super cool. So sure. And so that was actually my foray into corporate learning, where I started actually focusing on improving human performance using technology early on. But yeah, so then I ended up just continuing to kind of do that, but never through the traditional lens. I was never in like an HR learning function. I was always in a business function that was trying to do something and they needed somebody to help them do that. And so I got to experience a ton of different industries, ton of different fields. But ultimately that started my trajectory. And then I just kind of continued to grow in my career. But it's been a wild ride for sure.
Yeah. I mean, such an exciting story about the start. And, you know, I'm really happy that that company could notice that what you were doing was making an impact already, and that's how wonderful. Even if you did not know the technicalities of doing things, you were getting results in some form. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing
Yeah,
that.
it's funny. The same thing. The funny part is the same thing happened with being a people manager.
Mm.
I had no desire to lead people. I didn't think, but one of the leaders who was over me said, "You have kind of this way of just kind of like enabling and working with the people around you. Why don't you manage them?" And I remember being like, "What? No, no, that's not what I do." And they said, "Well, I'd really like you to, and it pays a little more." So I'm like, "Well, okay, I guess I'll do it." And once I went down that path, I'm like, "This is great. I'm an okay learning professional, but I actually really enjoy making other people be fantastic at what they do." So yeah, it's been fun.
Brilliant. Okay, that's a great start, Chris. I mean, aligned with our topic, if I were to just share that it is quite difficult for many L&D teams to really be able to, align learning to business. It's difficult.
Yeah.
How do we define measurable outcomes? Given that context that a lot of people have that challenge, but how would you define measurable outcomes?
Yeah. So I think despite being an introvert, I've always been really big on relationship building.
Hmm.
So I spend a lot of time relationship building, and that's actually been a really key activity that I found has been really helpful in accomplishing what you just asked. Like, how do we measure the outcomes?
Hmm.
Because a lot of times it comes from actually spending time with the stakeholder, but I don't even like calling them stakeholder because I'm like, I don't know, like my friend, my business partner type of a thing. And just spending time with them and figuring out what is it you really are hoping to accomplish by doing this. And what's interesting is I think it's easy to wrongly assume that by the time somebody comes to you and says, I think we need some training, it's easy to assume, well, obviously we must have defined that by now. And so it's easy to just like go off to the races and be like, okay, well, like let's build some training. And if they've given us this, let's design. And I've actually found more often than not, a lot of thought has not necessarily been put into what are we really trying to accomplish? Or what are we hoping things look like on the other side of doing this? And so the relationships that I've built, a lot of times that's actually where I start is I spend time going, I mean, obviously you think we need training, and I think everybody's got to find their own flavor of their personality. But a lot of times I'm just like, what what are you what are you hoping to do if we do this? And sometimes it hasn't been defined.
Hmm.
Sometimes it has. But honestly, I've always found so much value in actually taking the time to go through that because really refining that, it helps inform like, what should we do? Because sometimes it's like, well, I just really am trying to get people to behave more like this. And you go, well, if that's all we're trying to do, like maybe we just need to do this instead. And they're like, oh, I, okay. And sometimes it ends up being a lot simpler than you realize. So I've actually found that relationship building and just spending time understanding what people are hoping to accomplish.
Hmm.
That's really the key. Because once you know that, hitting a target's a heck of a lot easier when you actually paint one. That's a mistake that sometimes we can make is we wait until the training need comes to us to start the work instead of going, you don't need to wait for somebody to come say they need training. You know who the important people are that you work with.
Hmm.
Get to know them.
Hmm.
Figure out who they are, these kinds of things. And what I find, that's actually helped my team stay ahead of the request because sometimes they're talking about something and you go, we actually could probably help with that.
Hmm.
And really? Like, what do you mean? And you can find yourself finding those nuggets before they even realize that they're a gap. And then you really build that relationship.
Hmm. It could be more purposeful and more structured. essentially not living in silos and mingling with the business and knowing that better and probably having conversations ahead of time so that the relationship is set. Okay, excellent.
Yep.
So what sort of, measurable outcomes would you get from these?
I think the challenge that we have with measurement is that there's not this like universal framework
Right.
that you can just lay down and just go, well, measure this, and then you'll define, your value. There are definitely, and I think it depends too, because when I was over customer education, I had different targets
Hmm.
than when I was over sales or when I was over engineering or manufacturing or like, so it depends. But there are some consistent ones. So some of it is, yes, in that relationship, you identify like, what are you really hoping to accomplish? But even wherever you are, there are some underlying ones that you can actually start to just keep your eyes on that help you understand like, okay, well, if you're following your engagement numbers, those are things that you can kind of start to pay attention to go, well, do people feel like they have the resources they need to get their job done? That's usually an engagement question that is on most engagement surveys. If the answer to that is consistently low, probably a safe bet that, hey, we could probably improve these things. Turnover's another one that I've consistently been able to say, well, we can kind of watch 90-day turnover. If we're supporting people well those first 90 days, I'm not saying we own that metric. And I think sometimes that's where we can get into trouble as L&D is we can like overstate what we can do. But it is certainly something that, we can watch and go, I think there is some room for us to improve this. We've got a lot of there's a ton of manager data that comes through performance reviews and things like that, where you can go, you know what, I think we might be able to positively improve that. But the big thing is that you have to figure out what of those things do your leaders care about? Because that was something I learned the hard way in the beginning, where I was like, I think this metric is super important. And I would go try and convince them that it was. And if they didn't care, I was spending all this time trying to convince them you should care and all these other things. And it's not that you're never trying to help influence, but you can push a rock uphill for a long time if you're not really careful.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean here, because uh, as L&D, we may get very excited about certain metrics, but again, checking with stakeholders about what is it that they care for is very important. And that will get us a lot of buy-in once we align ourselves with the metrics that they care for.
I've seen it in a number of different research studies. That's what I do for fun. I actually read research on this stuff, but stories are more convincing than data.
Right.
And I think sometimes that's something we miss is we'll go, your 90-day retention is this number.
Yeah.
We need to do something about it. And people kind of go, yeah, I mean, whatever. It's a high turnover job, blah, blah, blah. But if you can actually tell a really compelling story that then gets at some of the problems that that are concerning them, all of a sudden you can get people to care about things that maybe they didn't care before because maybe they just aren't contextualizing it. Like, I don't understand what that has to do. But if you can personify it and actually help people go, hey, this is, and we actually did this once with an organization where we actually set up personas. I've done this a bunch of times, but we actually wrote personas and we said, this is this person and this is what their experience is like. And this is what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And these are some of the things that are preventing them from being effective in their job. And I remember there were metrics that before the leaders did not care about, but when they heard about Bill or Julie, this made up person that we told this story about, suddenly they were like, we don't want that to happen. And you're like, okay. So then here's what we can do about that.
What sort of outcomes should we be really caring about? It's a fact that a lot of upskilling programs, and I was looking at the LinkedIn Learning report, LinkedIn Learning Workplace Learning report, whatever it is, recent one, and it talks about a lot of large scale upskilling programs are consistently not reaching measurement stage.
They aren't.
What's the disconnect there? Are we doing things wrongly there? Is measurement not part of the?
No.
It's too difficult. What should we care about?
So if we're talking about the skill stuff specifically, I think for anybody, and I don't think this is usually a tough sell for people in L&D, because normally the people I encounter in L&D are usually very human-centered. They tend to care about people. And with the skill thing, there's never been a more important time to care about this, not for our sake, but really for the sake of employees. This is a very tumultuous time for people where they don't know what skills they need. They know they're falling short, but they don't know what to do about it. And there's real consequences to this. You know, companies are making decisions about people's jobs based on their skills, and people aren't ready for it. So I have a real heart for this because it matters a lot. I think where the gap is most companies and even a lot of L&D professionals, we have not taken the time to really deeply understand skills. We say that word a lot. You know, we need to upskill people. But when you really get into the brass tacks of, okay, but what's a skill? And how do you measure a skill? It usually stays at this like 100,000-foot level of like, well, communication's a skill, so get better at communicating. Like, communication is a multifaceted capability. There's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of skills within communication. What skills are you really trying to develop, and how do you measure what good looks like? And I would say very few programs actually go to that level of granularity where you're actually looking down to the behavioral level of what are the observable behaviors that tell you whether somebody has that skill. We have never defined skills, and we have never broken this down into the behavioral metrics of what actually goes into that. And how do I assess whether I'm actually good at communication, and what kind of communication? Maybe I'm different at virtual communication and even virtual communication. How do I assess whether I'm a good listener or I'm actually engaged? And so we're actually taking the time to break this stuff down, which I get in the past. It was not terribly scalable. And I think that's where some of the gaps have been. Artificial intelligence is making this way more scalable, and I think that's helping. But I honestly think that's where the biggest disconnect is we've kept our measures around skills far too high level and generic. As a good example of this, when I was at GE, we did this around sales. It was a big product initiative where we said, oh, we need more product training. And we really deconstructed that and said, what do you mean when you say we need more product training? Where is that breaking down? And we isolated it to a specific conversation that was happening between a salesperson and a physician. And then we broke that down further and we said, in that conversation, what behaviors should we be observing? And we were able to break that down into 5 things that we went, well, you should be doing this and this and this and this and this. And then we broke that down further and said, okay, with each of those 5, what does good look like in there? And let's put that on a sliding scale. And then we actually created simulations where people could do it. And we actually surgically said, of these 5 behaviors, you're only demonstrating 2 of them. And of those 2, the 2 you're only doing at like a level 2. You're not even doing them well. And so that helped people kind of go, oh, okay, now I can move the bars on these. And we actually saw a significant quantitative, measurable behavior change that then went to performance.
At some point of time, it was also known as competencies, and there are skills that make it up. And then at each of those skills, then you will have different people at different levels, which is what you measured. They were not at level 2 or something. And then you find a gap, right? And you train people accordingly.
Yep.
So we are trying to do the same thing in what you are describing. It's just that now, one, the technology is helping us make it more scalable and fast.
Yes.
Maybe with AI, and it is part of technology, but AI could be really the game changer on this part. Is that what we are looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it's both and.
Okay.
I think one of the risks that I see is that if you're not thinking about things and approaching things this way, we have a tendency to kind of do like Franken training. We're just kind of like, we'll take a little bit of this and a little bit, like, we'll just kind of like mix it together. And if you're doing that, artificial intelligence isn't going to help, because it's just going to help you make Franken trainings a heck of a lot faster and push them out the door, type of a thing. But if you actually get your operations thinking and working that way, then yes, because before it was very difficult to scale. It was very difficult to put people through that kind of simulation, to do things in a more surgical approach, because you're like, well, we only have this much time and we got to tell them all this stuff. And you're like, well, or now with technology, we can go, well, what if we just hit them with little like bite-sized parts of this along the way? So yeah, I think it can definitely be an enabler, but it's not a magic bullet. And I've seen people try and throw AI at this, and it's just made their problems worse.
We'll discuss more about AI as we go along, but yeah, I mean, it can probably make what you're doing more efficient. But if what you're doing is not really good enough, and if you don't look at the basics of that before making it more efficient, you're just doing the same thing much faster, maybe much cheaper.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, that's a mistake that we may be making in some cases, but yeah, we just need to be a little cautious on that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's probably safe to say we're making that mistake. And I'll be honest, I've been guilty of it myself. So it's not me saying like, oh, everyone else is doing it. I've been there too.
Tell me, in your experience, what has been some typical challenges that the L&D faces? One we have talked about, they may jump into picking up an order, they don't build relationships, but other challenges that they may face uh, in terms of delivering impact.
Yeah. Will be the first to say that doing things differently, like what we just described, is really hard. And on top of it, it's not what most of your senior business leaders and your stakeholders are used to.
Mm.
And so this can be a really tough. So a lot of times when I talk about this, a lot of people are like, yeah, but how did you do it? Because I've tried that and I've gotten my teeth kicked in and was told, shut up and go just make an e-learning or just go make a training thing. And there's no ignoring the fact that that is the reality of it. There is enormous pressure when you're working against your business leaders who, in their mind, and I don't fault them for it.
Yeah.
Everybody grew up, and so much of what we see as bad professional behavior has to do with people's childhoods. It's just carried its way into adulthood. And if you think about it, most people went to school, and what did they do in school? They sat in a desk and a teacher talked at them for 15, 14 years, and they took a test, and they don't really know what went into it, but that's what they did. And so when they come to you and go, we need to educate people, we need to train people, if you come back and go, well, actually what we're going to do is this, they're going to go, that doesn't, what? Like, no, that's not what I'm familiar with. And so you have to recognize that you're playing the long game. And that's really hard. And it takes discipline and patience and a lot of relationship building. And going back to my point about relationship building, you need those strong relationships because you're going to present things to them that they're going to go, no, I'm not doing that. And if you don't have the relationship where they have the trust where you can go, I know this looks weird and I understand this is very foreign to you, but you hired me to be the expert in this space. Are you just going to trump me because what? It's not what you're familiar with? And you have to have the relationship to do that, because otherwise, as I have found out, you'll get kicked out of the conference room. It'll be like, just get out of here. So that's really hard. And I talk to my peers a lot because a lot of times and I've said this to my teams, and I say this a lot. My job would be 1,000 times easier if we were just an order checking team. My job would be easier. Like all the incentives for me, it would be so much easier just to be like, you know what, team, just make a stupid course. Go stand up a workshop, do it. Eventually, people would start to get frustrated because it wasn't effective, but I could probably swing it and, sell it and spin it that that's good enough. And so there's a lot of pressure, and I respect the fact that that's hard. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that you're playing the long game. And so you have to understand, when should I compromise? When is this a hill not worth dying on for the sake of building a relationship that I can then maybe try and change things later? Who are the early adopters that are more open to some of this stuff? I mean, I can't tell you how many companies I've been in where I've really teamed with like a good partner who thought differently and was like, okay, like little unorthodox, but I'm game. And then when they got the results, all of a sudden all their peers were like, what, like, how did that happen? And you're like, well, I mean, I've been telling you to do this for a long time, but that doesn't happen in 3 months or 6 months or a year. And that's hard. I think the other thing that can be really hard is in our field, there's a tendency to focus on the creative, the human, the fun side of what we do. And your operations will set the threshold for how successful you can be. And a lot of times, that's not the fun stuff to look at. So the way work happens in your team, the handoffs between different skill sets, the way you're structured, like my team looks much more like a product development team than an L&D team, because we've really fine-tuned and refined our operations so that we can actually meet the needs of the organization at a different level. But again, that's not usually the stuff you're going to hear spoken from at the big conferences. Nobody's up there going, let's talk about L&D org effectiveness. That's not really fancy. We don't talk about that kind of stuff as much. And it's not going to, get you a keynote at the CLO exchange conference or anything like that. But that's the kind of stuff that, like, well, sometimes you just got to focus on the nuts and the bolts and the blocking and tackling, because if you're not doing that very well, you're going to kind of catch yourself. So I think those are two that immediately come to mind that I think are just really hard. And then we'll talk about the technology piece, I'm sure, but that's also really hard because it's changing super fast. It's completely reimagining what our role is. And a lot of people didn't get into this field to be technical people. I had the fortunate benefit of being a total tech head and then coming in. But for a lot of people, they're like, wait a minute, like I didn't get into this to think about system architecture and how to use artificial intelligence alongside this. And so I understand that for a lot of people, it's like, this is really uncomfortable for me. And I'm not used to how to think about these kinds of things. So there's no shortage of challenges. And that's where I'm really sensitive to that.
I will again pick up the AI one, but I really like these three because at a high level, these are probably really big things that are playing out. And the first one, which is playing a long game and the pressure that you get. Uh, I read this book by Dr. Keith Keating about the
Yep.
trusted learning advisor, and I think it probably, your sentiments are exactly the same that he talks about in that book, and he gives a good path. And I really loved the way he's talked about. One thing that really stood out for me was, I think he talks about you are living in two worlds at the same time. You are trying to be a consultant and take people along and move them forward, but at the same time, you're also being an order taker for some of the projects where you haven't built the relationships and these are early days, maybe they are very senior, whatever. But like you said, you have to show it to one team and then the others will start taking notice of that, etc. So I think it aligns perfectly. And so thank you for sharing that. It is a challenge. But at the same time, the second one that you talk about, which is we focus on the creative fun side, but not on the stacks of L&D. it probably links to the first one in some way. It's almost about training the L&D team to be able to do this job better, and also building that conviction and belief that in times of pressure you are able to perform the way you have been trained. So that's the second one, which is, I don't know, that's how I'm thinking. Is that resonating?
It's a very good point, because a good example of this is, I think of the military and the way they train people for high stress, high pressure situations. I mean, there's a reason they're constantly doing drills and they put you through boot camp and all this. It's because in moments of stress, we go back to usually our lowest common denominator, whatever we're comfortable with. And if you have not just really reinforced that, like, no, this is what we do, you're going to hit that stress wall and you're just going to go, we'll just take the order. Like, whatever, this is getting too stressful. The person's getting edgy and I'm not comfortable with this. So I'm just going to go back to it. And you really have to fight through that. I mean, the amount of time I've invested in making all my teams throughout the years be like, you are a consultant first. No, I'm an instructional designer. No, you're a consultant. You're an instructional designer second. No, I'm an LMS admin. No, you're a consultant.
Mhm.
You're a consultant that does LMS administration work.
Mhm.
And that takes practice. And to any senior leaders who listen to this, that takes you clearing the path for that.
Yeah.
Because that's where we can make a big difference in this. Because if you're saying, I want you to be consultants and I want you to be different and challenge, but then the second things get tough, you kind of go like, well, just like do it. I'm not going to take the bullets for you. That's not their fault. That's your fault. You needed to clear the path. And that's where I say I don't have any hair, because I'm like, I will keep clearing the path. I will keep having the fights. When you run into resistance, you call in me. I'll be the Air Force and I'll come in and I'll, bomb the path to clear the way so that you can just keep putting one foot in front of the other. But that's hard.
Yes, it is. It is. And again, I mean, all sympathies to the L&D teams, because, like you said, this is hard. Even if they realize what they have to do, building that practice, conviction, belief that this right thing has to be done in this way, in spite of whatever pressure they are facing, I think that's a big thing. And I'm sure people are trying, like you are saying, you are building that team to do that. I'm sure other people are doing, and gradually we are seeing that changing in multiple organizations.
Yeah. But it's hard. And I know, because I've hired people in and there's almost like an L&D PTSD where, like, I've hired people into my orgs and I've been like, hey, do it differently. And they're almost kind of like, are you sure? Like, I don't know about that, but I get it. You try things hard and you try to do things different. You get punched a few times. You get a little nervous. I get it.
And also, one of the things that, I found sometimes could be useful when you face the stakeholders who don't believe in the way you are trying to do training is to ask them, how did you learn driving? And most people have that experience. Could you have learned it through one program that was given in a classroom, or e-learning, without practice, without doing it over a period of time, and without building that proficiency? So we've tried that.
Yeah.
It works with some people.
Yep. Yeah. Well, and I think it's just like anything. It takes time. I think a lot of people are looking for, like, what's the easy button we hit to get here? And it's like, anybody who's ever like tried to lose weight or get in shape.
Right. We come to that technology question then. How is our focus on measurement changing with new tech, advancement of AI? And before you begin, I mean, let's see it from someone who's really not convinced. Is AI a fad like metaverse was? Because 2 years ago we were seeing metaverse everywhere at all conferences, and now
Yeah.
nobody's talking about it. And some people will also think about, does AI really know enough about me, our organization, our context, our scenarios, etc.? So just with that as a
Yeah.
background, how do you see AI helping us or moving us forward in this direction?
So I'll address the metaverse one very quickly and say that has been an interesting field, that the hardware and the mix of the hardware and the organizational adoption and just cultural adoption, it's just been a weird mix. I actually still am a big advocate. It's still going to come, but just in different veins, in different ways. And actually, it's still here. I mean, I've been using metaverse stuff for a long time. So sometimes people are like, oh, that's not really a thing. I'm like, well, actually, it is. It's a very successful and effective thing. It's just not there. But so I think, but I understand where sometimes we have these hype cycles where it's like, this is the next big thing. I think artificial intelligence, though, is different in that I see it in the same vein as like electricity or the internet, where some of the ways I heard it talked about, I don't see it being helpful because I think people are viewing it wrong, where they're going, oh, will AI be the next big thing? And then if you ask, well, what do you mean by AI? They mean a specific thing instead of the broader application of artificial intelligence. And the reality is it's not going anywhere. So I will just say that right now, when you look at one, it's massive adoption, but then I'm in regular communication with a lot of these big tech companies who are doing this stuff, and the amount of money by governments and big companies that are going, I'm like, this is not going anywhere at all. If anything, we're just going to see it explode, which I get kind of freaks people out. So I understand that, but I really do think about it more like electricity or the internet. So when people are like, will AI continue? It's like, well, I mean, yes, but will it continue the way we're seeing it used today? In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. In some ways, I would actually say the big flavor of AI that caught everybody's attention in 2022, the Gen AI movement, a lot of that for a lot of people has already started moving into just steady state adoption. I think not everybody's there, but for a lot of people, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, it's kind of already integrated into the ethos of what we do. In terms of some of the concerns about, will it disrupt our industry? I think it absolutely will, but I think we have a lot more control over what happens with that than we realize. And I say this all the time to not just L&D professionals, but business professionals all the time, where they're going, can AI replace what people do? And I'm like, yeah, there's certain things that it can do really, really well, but that's not new. But you also then have to ask, like, well, what does good look like? And so then where are you looking to apply that kind of stuff? And I think that's where, going back to what we said before about how important it is to understand your operations, understand what you do, understand the role that you play. That's actually going to help you identify, like, where is AI actually really, really good for doing some of this stuff? And where would we go, no, it doesn't actually really make sense for this because it doesn't necessarily help us with this or that. I think if you don't do that work, that's where AI is going to be extremely disruptive, because, it's going back to a good example of this would be like when graphical user interfaces came to web design.
Mm.
And, to build a website, you used to have to know HTML5 and JavaScript, and you had to be really good at that. And building a website was like a big deal.
Yeah.
If you weren't skilled in that, forget it. And then came along, Squarespace and Wix and all this other stuff, and somebody could just kind of go boop, boop, boop. If you were that web designer that was convinced that the only way anybody would ever build a website was this, you were going to get disrupted. And I think, in L&D, if you're going, nobody builds digital content like I do, well, I don't know about that. AI is actually pretty good at taking things and breaking it into pieces and doing all these other things, but I don't know that that's necessarily where we add the most value anyway. So I think it's about figuring out, I tell people a lot of times, treat AI like a brilliant intern.
Yeah.
Super intelligent, has access to more resources than you could possibly imagine, can process more information than you could in multiple lifetimes. but in many ways it has zero context to anything. And so it's just doing what it predicts is the best thing. You're the one who knows the context. You're the one who knows, whoa, if you do that, that's really stupid. Just like you wouldn't tell an intern, hey, can you put together my next board presentation, and not give them any direction, and they just go off and they research board presentation, they do it, and you come back and go, what the heck is this? But you do that the right way and say, these are the key things. I really want to make sure that we figure this out. This is where you can leverage that. It's going to make your life a whole lot easier. So I think that's been my observations, and I'm staying really close to this, and we're integrating it into pretty much everything we do. I don't think there's really anything that we don't have AI integrated into it's in some capacity.
Absolutely. Taking this a little further, how do you see in future AI helping in the impact side? One is of course content creation and those kind of things. And I think if you're doing it reasonably okay right now, AI can probably take it over. If you're doing high level design, etc., which is focused on business metrics, etc., AI may have less to do with that. That's what my understanding is. But really, in creating business impact or impact with training, how do you see AI helping going forward?
It's really a good thought partner and can help take some of the legwork out of this. So going back to some of the examples I gave before, where you're going to need to spend time getting to understand what is really that problem that, this person is trying to solve. Generative AI can be a really powerful tool to say, all right, like, again, it's a thought partner. Work with it and go, all right, here's the situation. Here's the audience. Here's the problem. Here's what we're trying to do. Let's brainstorm some creative ideas of how might we solve this problem, and how might we measure whether this is it. And sometimes it's like, well, I have to come up with that. And it's like, no, you don't. You just have to decide what's a good idea and what's a bad idea. And so it can be a really helpful thought partner in pulling some of that stuff together. But then also, like, I think of, and we just did this recently, the behavioral stuff. I said before, it's very difficult to actually take a skill or a competency and break it into skills, and then break it into the behavioral components, and then establish behavioral metrics associated with each one of those. Good grief, Gemini or Anthropic or Open, like, it can do this in seconds, where you can just go, here's the skill I'm trying to solve for. Break that down into X number of behaviors and make each of those behaviors on a sliding 5-point scale and describe in multiple bullets how we would assess each. And it can create that rubric for you. You'll spend hours just trying to think this stuff up or researching it. In a matter of seconds, you can have that so that you can focus your time more on, okay, now how do I focus on influencing or building the relationship or implementing this kind of stuff? And I think that's one of the things that's huge. The other one, though, that is extremely powerful, that at the end of last year, I said 2024, this is where I was one of the influencers that was like, this is a thing that we need to be marching towards. AI is opening the gates for active learning, where we can actually say, go do this, and then we're going to assess how well you did it. Because now AI can see, it can listen, it can analyze all this stuff. And so now we can say, all right, we've established these metrics, we've established these behaviors. Let's train an AI model to observe and look and measure this stuff. And now we can either, when people are doing the work or in an isolated simulation, ask people to do things and then very quickly assess. Like before, just as a simple example, I remember once, it was a while back, where we were trying to assess people's presentation skills. And we had everybody record a video for 5 minutes or 10 minutes and send it in. And then we had to sit and like watch these things. And it was a wonderful learning experience because it forced people to practice. It was horrible to try and assess, because you're like, oh my gosh, we have 250 of these 10-minute videos that we now have to watch, versus AI can watch all 250 of those things in seconds, and you tell it what to look for in those things, and it can spit all this stuff out. And so I think that's where the formerly impossible when it comes to measurement is suddenly very attainable now.
That's a great use case. Absolutely. Apart from being a good thinking partner or an intern, I think, yeah, this is a excellent use case. Apart from AI, are
Yep.
there other technologies that you're looking at which could help us in enhancing impact of training?
I still am very much staying close to the immersive tech, just because of the fact. And I actually don't even call it like XR, VR anymore. I call it spatial learning.
Mhm.
So I'm following kind of spatial learning and what's possible with that, which again, AI is rapidly accelerating the possibilities with that. I think about personalization and our ability to really reach people where they are. These things are all tied to very similar technologies, because even, chatbot technology, which can be used to automate, we did a non-AI version of a chatbot for onboarding last year. It was super effective. It knew where people were in the life cycle of their employee journey, and it texted them relevant resources and information and checked in on them. And those kinds of things really allow us to meet people where they are. And in my opinion, that's really what good learning does, is it says, I know this is what you're trying to do, and I know this is what you're struggling with. Here's the nudge or the, shoulder you can lean on to help you get through that. And I think that is coming a long ways.
I think chatbots is one big area, especially with AI. AI-powered chatbots could be a very effective use of technology for learning, where individuals can interact with bots to find information, learn, do things, give answers, get responses, feedback, etc. I think that's a wonderful development we're going to see. Excellent.
Yep.
Chris, I think it's been a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed discussing all of these points with you. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me. And it's been a super fun conversation. So I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.